Even AI.
yes.
I hate the fact that people call it that. It's not like what we would consider to be AI. It's not what science fiction considers to be AI. It's just it's a plagiarism machine. That's all it is. It's an algorithmic plagiarism machine.
Yeah.
Awful. I mean, the most heinous thing ever. I mean,
It's a bubble. It's a classic bubble. It's tulips and startups from the 2000s. That's all it is. It's
Exactly.
a pop.
Yeah,
it's going to go away. It is. I mean, it's unsustainable. It's absolutely unsustainable. The amount of
there's nothing there. This is the thing. There's nothing there. It's like all those startups in the early 2000s. I this and I that. You know, the .com bubble, as journalists decided to call it. 9/10 of it was just smoke and mirrors. It wasn't anything. It was just chancers setting up new companies, calling themselves whatever. You know, a random noun. This is my new company, and they didn't do anything. They didn't produce any value. So an AI is doing exactly the same thing.
But
it's
so
not going to produce any
was
value.
Conferred onto them that they all ended up the so-called CEOs of these .com all ended up with a huge monetary value being attached to it erroneously. It's like, oh yes, I have a company that's worth $20 billion. So, no, you don't.
I mean, like at least with tulips, you know, tulips actually exist and they are actually attractive plants.
Yes,
like
they're actually
the problem with the tulip bubble was that they massively overestimated the extent to which people like them. But people do actually like them. They are real things, you know. Whereas with AI,
I did see someone make a comment about AI, which said that AI had led them back to God and the idea of the human soul, confronting an AI art is proof that we must have a soul.
I agree, because there is something fundamentally wrong with it. When you encounter it, there's something uncannily wrong about it.
Uncanny is the word. It is strangely uncanny. I have to confess to being oddly fascinated by a lot of AI art.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's real uncanny valley. It really messes with everything. That, you know, when I look at it, I think, wow, it's like that mutant photorealism. It's very strange. It's very
I'm fascinated with sort of. I mean, I've stopped now, but for a while I was playing around with it. I stopped when I realized that, like crypto, it's actually burning up a staggering amount of
huge energy consumption.
Yeah, but for a while back there, I was playing around with it, and the thing that fascinated me with it was the process of trying to get it to do what I wanted it to do, because AI, at least the various systems that I've played around with, they are staggeringly bad at taking instruction. Like, you know, you really have to try to. And what I found is that if you want to get it to do what you want, you have to kind of force it to learn. You know, it has to be able to learn. It has to have a heuristic element to its programming. Otherwise, it'll never achieve anything. And that means that that anything that it ever achieves will be in collaboration, quote unquote, with human beings teaching it, which is just another way of saying that it's humans doing it. It's just a human using a tool.
Yeah.
I did find that the gap, if you like, to be the interesting thing, the gap between human intention, what we actually want it to present, and what it presents. It's that gap which is interesting, where the slip happens. The slide into, well, no, that's not what I meant, but what you've done is really unsettling and therefore kind of fascinating.
What I found with it, though, is that it can be unsettling, but it's always unsettling in a sort of banal way. The creepiness of it is always kind of empty and blank. It's always sort of mediocre and brainless, isn't it? It never comes up with anything that's disturbing because there's anything interesting about it.
Right, because there's profundity there. No.
I think it's also it's like in its early stages of what we were talking about earlier, the .coms and everything. It was fascinating for the first few goes, and now, because you realise how homogenized, how flattened out it is, how everything is the same, then of course it loses an awful lot of that initial impact. But when I was seeing it for the first time, this is so that it became but yes, it's lost that now.
I mean, it's like, to me, it's like scientific proof of Debord's theory of the spectacle. You know, because Debord comes up with the idea of the spectacle as the idea of this whole sort of visual world that we live in as an expression of the basic exploitative relations of capital. And AI kind of just comes along and like proves that in a laboratory, because you AI, because it is, as you said, a plagiarism machine. It creates images, and if you use the text versions, you know, paragraphs, from just plagiarizing and stealing and pilfering, you know, scobs of visual material from our culture, which is, of course, capitalist culture. It ends up mindlessly reproducing the visuals of our culture. So it ends up mindlessly reproducing the ideology and the power relationships of our culture. So you ask it for something, and it will give you sort of instinctively, it'll give you not a real you know, if you I saw an image that was going around once of like Victorian maids. Somebody had obviously gone to an AI picture generator and asked for a photograph of Victorian maids, right? And what you ended up with was not something that looked like a photograph from the 1880s or whatever of maidservants. What you got was something that looked, to the extent that it looked like anything real at all, it looked like a still from a Netflix series, from Downton Abbey or something like that. Because what it's done, it hasn't actually tried to reproduce reality. What it's done, because it has mindlessly just taken from our visual universe that we've created in Western capitalist culture, it's created an image which is actually a reproduction of that. It's a reproduction of the spectacle. It's a reproduction of how we represent these things in capitalist media culture. So the girls all look like you know, runway models, except in sort of sexualized uniforms and things like this. It's really fun, because it's like somebody said, how do we take Debord's sort of you know, this theory in the social sciences, and we prove it with a machine, and it's done. It's
done it.
like,
incredible. And this is the interesting thing. This is what Google was trying to sort of get round when they did that thing recently. You remember the thing where the Google AI picture generator was generating like images of the American founding fathers, and it was generating pictures of them as people of color, you know, and black women and things like that. And of course, the right absolutely collectively lost their.
Of course they did.
Functioned it as, you know, woke social engineering and woke psychological warfare and so on and so forth, and all this that. What's
all
actually
the paranoid
happening
bullshit
is that
from
AI,
the right,
all the usual paranoid, cynical bullshit. You know, they can, you know, Alex Jones can just feed his listeners and viewers so many metric fuck tons of bullshit based on that, and Rogan and all the rest of them, Jordan Peterson, all the rest of them, they're just on it like flies on shit. But the thing that was actually happening there, I think, is that because these systems mindlessly reproduce our culture, our visual culture, the spectacle, they therefore, as I say, they mindlessly reproduce our ideology. So they mindlessly reproduce things like the white supremacy that is just inherently encoded in all our narrative visual culture, Hollywood, etc. So they're trying to get around this. So what they're trying to do is kind of like, in Western capitalist visual culture now, in recent decades, what we've done, instead of actually doing anything about white supremacy and racism, what we've done is we've decided to put this sort of gloss on our society in. We've just exactly colorblind casting, and of course, and I'm not necessarily saying I don't necessarily disagree with colorblind casting. Like I've seen colorblind cast shows that, you know, Shakespeare plays at the Globe, and they're great, no problem. But what you get is things like every depiction of the past now in the Western capitalist culture industries. You just have people of color walking around, and it's nice to see them after decades of people of, you know, brown faces and black faces being excluded from our visual culture. But what the effect it's had, the actual effect it's had, whether it's intended or not, is to create this alternative reality where racism never existed and white supremacy never existed.
You know, this
is it. If you're going to
what they're trying to do in the AI visuals is they're trying to get around the fact that AI mindlessly produces white faces just automatically. In the same way, you put into Google beautiful woman, you get a page. The search results are all white women. If you put into your average AI, beautiful woman, you just get a white woman automatically, because that's so deeply encoded in our culture, that white supremacy. So they're trying to get around it. So you have a side effect, like they try to counter that in programming. You have a side effect like an AI that will give you a black Thomas Jefferson and stuff like that.
That's where you jump
I'm actually fascinated by this.
That's where you jump from Guy Debord into Deleuze and Guattari, because that whole idea of in white Western capitalist society, the white person, well, the white male exists, as they say, both in the primary and the secondary, whereas obviously a woman and anyone of color in those societies exists only in the secondary. So you've got Guy Debord all through AI, Guy Debord intersecting with like 1,000 Platos, intersecting with, in its own way, Walter Benjamin, the age of art, the mechanical age of reproduction, all these things intersecting. So it is fascinating. But I must admit, what you were just saying there, Jack, it's one area that I find very, very difficult to navigate, because there is a part of me that says, ironically, the colorblind casting sometimes in certain things looks like a whitewashing. It's a whitewashing of a historical master narratives and so on.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, there's one part of me says, oh well, you as you say, you're just creating an alternative history where these awful things didn't happen. But then there's this other part of me which says, okay, how many times can a black audience, every time they switch on their television or film, and if they are featured, have to have the racism angle? They have to have the continued material horror of having to confront their own historical racism. So it's really hard. It's really hard.
It is.
And this is something that we've kind of discussed before. And I'm very aware of the fact that if you're a person in one of those groups that has been historically marginalized and historically oppressed and so on and so forth, the idea of narrative culture, particularly narrative culture, every time you see somebody like that, like yourself in that, you are watching a story about your own marginalization or your own oppression, and how crushing and soul destroying, tiring, and just boring that must be. Why does this story always about me or people like me always have to be about this? I totally get that. The trouble we have, and this ties in with all the colorblind casting projected back into the past, like people in 1920, Wonder Woman in 1920. She's, there's just people of all sorts of colors walking around in London, and nobody remarks upon it because racism never existed, etc. That's Doctor Who, absolutely. Doctor Who's huge with it. What we've done is we're still telling the same stories. We're fundamentally still telling stories about white bourgeois people in the imperial center. We're still, and their history, the history of the colonial and the imperial power, the colonial and the imperial powers. We're still telling those stories. We've just put this United Colors of Benetton gloss on them to pretend, to sanitize them, to pretend exactly. We're doing that rather than expanding the types of stories that we're telling. So we're not actually changing anything at all. We're just telling the same stories, but the tokenism of putting all sorts of different people into them in this sanitized way, whereby through the in itself laudable aim of
quite right
of expressing sort of modern liberal ideas about equality and equal dignity and stuff like that. What we're doing is distorting the past, because we can't stop telling the same stories. We've got to put these people into it now because we want to be fair and equal, etc. But they've got to fit into our stories, and the price they have to pay is that we all have to just kind of pretend that the homophobia and the colonialism and the imperialism and the sexism and the racism and the white supremacy and the slavery, it never really happened. We were kind of always friends, really.
Exactly.
The difference between the reformist and the transformist, isn't it? As ever, it's just, we'll tinker at the edges, we'll reform. Whereas actually, what it needs is complete transformation. And part of it is the hegemonic presence of white writers and white creators, who I'm sure feel that they are doing the right thing. But as you say, it's because fundamentally they can't move off the same mode of storytelling and the same stories. And of course they can't, because it's part of their culture and heritage.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's ahistorical, isn't it? You have to pretend that history didn't happen, and very often these shows will sort of subtly acknowledge that the tensions are there, but then dismiss them completely. We're not dealing with that. We're not going to even talk about that because we want to present this very particular, very sort of liberal, middle upper class narrative. And it's really problematic. It really is problematic on so many levels.
It's incredible. Yeah, it creates a completely distorted idea of history, which in the long run does more to damage the cause of progressing past things like racism and homophobia, because it removes the context those things are based in. So it removes people's ability to understand them and to understand what those those structural bigotries and structural oppressions. It removes people's ability to contextualize them in terms of history, in terms of these big trans era structures that we're still living in. This is the central problem.
They become somewhat free floating and
they just become the classic liberal idea of racism, which is like individual bad people have stupid ideas.
Exactly that. It's not systemic.
And that's why in this sort of storytelling about the past, the good people in the past are always the people who think like us. They're always the modern, enlightened 21st century
projected
liberals,
into the past.
somehow sort of transported back to 1870 or 1920 or whatever like that.
Yeah. Which is just endemic, symptomatic of the whole thing.
Well, you are right though. It is very thorny. It's very difficult to actually deal with because it does. It does get boring when you are watching the same stories play out over and over again, and it's always about your oppression or about your.
God, I can only imagine.
It is so.
I can only imagine.
It's so boring. And very often it's not done very well. That's the other thing. 90% of the time, it's done very badly because of the prevalence of straight white men in the writing circles of these mediums, but again, really in the same way that we won't stop telling the same stories, and as you pointed out earlier, a lot of that is to do with the fact that we won't stop. The same people are still hegemonic inside the material production of these stories. Oh, absolutely!
They keep coming back. They come back to do the 2-hour special of the show that they did 20 years ago, or they get given the keys to revive it wholesale, or it's like there's a lot of guys sort of up in their 60s and 70s now who are basically still running popular culture. They were the young firebrands at one point. There was this brief moment where these people came through, and now they're just still here.
Yeah, they're the establishment now. Of course, they are the establishment.
Is simmers down to just a continual nowness.
Yeah, it's just fascinating seeing it from
the
inside.
Of the 21st century.
It's something that we're seeing in the writing community at the moment, particularly within genre fiction. Obviously, what's happening because of the liberation of the format and the ability to publish, there are just so many new voices now. There was about 5 years ago, there was just an absolute renaissance in women horror writers, an absolute renaissance, and the work they are doing. People like Laura Marrow and Georgina Bruce,
Priya
Sharma. Oh my God, all the fabulous.
I just did.
So good.
I just produced it's not horror, it's science fiction, but Megan E.
O'Keefe, Martin,
who I've just come across, who's done this kind of feudal punk science fiction saga. Very good, actually. I produced it rather than narrated it, but she's really made a breakthrough, and she's relatively young. She's 39, and really interesting premise to her work as well. This whole idea around she's basically taken 3D printing and just pulled it to its to a really interesting and wonderfully sort of surreal, absurd conclusion where people are 3D printed.
But interesting. I do like that.
It's the way that the ruling class, the establishment, create situations such as double printing people. And of course, if you're double printed, you're impaired. Well, then they have control over you. They hide your other print. That's just one thing that they do. But the horror at the heart of her writing, which I just think is absolutely fantastic, is the notion that a person who has been multi-printed, and it's been particularly useful to the military, as you can imagine. Down they go. You just reprint them. But there is a probability, and it depends on all sorts of factors in the person, their personality, and also their biology and the mechanism itself, where you can be what they call cracked. She calls it cracked, and when your print cracks, you basically enter an unconscious, everlasting scream forever. Forever. It's a really good piece of horror at the center of this space opera, really. And when I was working with the actor doing it, I mean, we stopped. I said, let's just stop for a moment, because this is so terrifying. This idea of, and it was one particular character, I'd sort of worked out the odds that they were very likely to crack. And yeah,
I like it. It's dealing with sort of old science fiction concerns of consciousness and identity.
Oh,
isn't
yeah,
it? It's very like it's the old thing. It's the old thing about the
technology and so on.
Isn't it?
Oh, exactly that. It's dressing it up in obviously the new technology. But it's really interesting that you should say that, actually, George, because one of the things I was saying to the actor I was working with, the narrator I was working with, he's quite a bit younger than me, so he didn't have the reference. And I said, I'm not a sort of bona fide Trekkie. I said, but just by existing in the period of time that I existed, I couldn't avoid Star Trek. And there's lots of bits of Star Trek that I really love, and lots I've not seen. I said, but there's one scene that has stayed with me from a child to now, and it is from that first movie when it's nothing to do with the rest of the story, but they have the transporter accident. I don't know if you guys remember this. There's a scene right at the beginning of the film. They're just beaming aboard two of the officers, and they experience an issue with the transporter, and it goes wrong, and the sequence is brilliantly done. You get this echoing scream as the forming people sort of realize what's happening to them, and then the lights go and everything goes out, and I think it's Kirk contacts the other end of the transmission and says, have you got them? And a voice on the end says, yeah, we got what's left of them. Fortunately, they didn't last very long. And you're like, whoa! And for a series that is so often locked into this idea of adventure and militarism or exploration, that is pure horror. And as a kid, when I first because when I was a kid, obviously you don't quite get all the detail of the dialogue, but there was a certain point, I must have been around 10, right? And it's stayed with me ever since. It's been just one of the most frightening things I've ever seen in a film, and yet, and yet you get nothing. You just get the scream and the dialogue. But it's just. But yeah, this book series by Megan O'Keefe really sort of capitalizes on that kind of horror, science fiction horror and technological horror. But she's a great
so much
example.
fun, isn't it? It's so much fun to play with. I've always wanted to write a story about where transporter technology just becomes de rigueur. It does away with roads and rail systems, and it saves the world effectively because climate change just stopped. It just stopped. But there are existential problems with it. Well,
it's
because of course it's effectively a photocopier, because it's effectively a human photocopier. It's reproducing an idea.
Well, once Star Trek actually started to confront that, and I think it wasn't until Next Gen that it's basically just started to confront the sordid truth that you were obliterated.
The fact that it's a universe basically based on mass suicide constantly.
You're obliterated at one end and you're reconstituted at another, but it's a new you effectively. I mean, they play around, they hint at it a lot. I say a lot. They hint at it in certain episodes, as I recall, and there's a sort of let's not go there because their whole society rests on it. To confront,
is it? Your whole society relies upon this technology, and I mean the horror of that, the absolute soul-gnawing horror of that. How many of me has done?
They're playing around with it in a very interesting way in this new version of Star Trek, which I've actually really been rather won over by Strange New Worlds, which is they have this again. It's in a a context where they're fighting an enemy, they're fighting the Gorn, and when soldiers, Federation Starfleet soldiers, are really badly injured, they just lock them in transporter locks, or will deal with their injuries later. And then there's this one fantastic sequence where they're getting wounded in, and one of the medical staff says, we can't put any more people inside transporter lock, but we're not being able to do our meatball surgery fast enough. And her superior officer, I mean, not with any callousness, it's just a ruthless decision. He just goes back through the logs, finds the earliest ones, just wipes out 50 of them.
Wipes the hard
recycle bin.
Too late.
Yeah.
They're right to the recycling bin. And he said, and she looks aghast. And he said, well, to be quite honest, with the deterioration, the degradation of the copy, that because we've held it in stasis for so long, we might have had to have done even greater major surgery. These people are still got a chance, because they're fresh meat. And they ran an arc with the doctor in this current, whose daughter is very, very ill, his young daughter, and he has her hidden in a lock unbeknownst to Starfleet, and it's all to do with the sort of ethics of that and everything. But yeah, so it's interesting how that series is confronting the horror of that technology even more.
If that is how it works, then the Federation, which is supposedly this great sort of humanist utopia, it is actually the most cynical and anti-humanist civilization imaginable, because it's
industrial
based upon
extermination.
Yes, but it's not just that, is it? It's based upon the underlying assumption that the individual self is nothing more than just a pattern. I mean, that's actually the word
really
thing, isn't it?
Exactly
The transporter
what it is,
pattern. And as long as you can reassemble it, and it will do and say the same things, as long as you can press a button and reproduce a unit which looks the same and sounds the same, as the same set of skills,
function, right?
Exactly. That's good enough. That's just what people are. People are just patterns of skills and training.
It's the Richard Dawkins future.
Yeah, it's the algorithmic, the algorithm of humanity, isn't it? That's what it's reducing human beings to.
Which is so fascinating, because the series is also, and it's interesting dichotomy. I don't just mean Strange New Worlds, I mean all of Star Trek, certainly since the 80s version. It sort of has this dichotomy, this thing that runs through it, which is exactly what you've just said, Jack. We're merely, it's the reductionist view, the biological reductionist view. Oh, you're just patterns. You can actually be whittled down to numbers, really, numbers in a code. And yet at the same time, because of things like the confrontation with Q, it's all about the transcendent. Oh, surely we're something else. Surely we're better. We can reach for something, trans-evolution. And
this is the great sort of overcompensation that Trek engages in, isn't it? Because Trek is notionally set in this material universe, like to the point where there has to be pseudoscience that's meticulously worked out to lampshade things like inertia when they go in warp drive and stuff like that. And they have to be able to send signals from across light years in a matter of in a dramatically convenient amount of time, let alone travel. They need to be able to communicate in dramatically convenient amounts of time. So they invent this concept of subspace and things like this. So they're working around the assumption that they live in the material universe, and yet there is this strain of deep 60s hippie mysticism that runs through the entire thing.
Deep Space Nine, the whole wormhole, the spirit, the prophets, everything.
Having just worked through Deep Space Nine, that's the iteration of it that works best, because it just goes full balls
really
to
goes
the wall. The supernatural.
Just goes for mysticism.
It doesn't quite say the supernatural, but it basically does. Like, it doesn't work otherwise. By the time you get to the end of Deep Space Nine, you've got demonic fire entities that are coming into existence because people say magic spells that they got from a book, and the book was blank, and you get the magical writing in the book by murdering somebody and drawing their blood into the book. I mean, that's the supernatural. You can put as much lampshading on it as you like. It just is, right?
It is old-fashioned.
And Deep Space Nine goes there. Yeah, it
And all
takes
the
it
better
sort of
for
7 seasons to talk itself right the way there, but it does it, and I appreciate that.
Yes.
As opposed to some of the more bad faith sort of coping with the cognitive dissonance that you see in other parts
But
of the
then
series.
I think it is I know we're not here to talk about Star Trek, but it's a series that basically its fuel is about half a dozen cognitive dissonances or strange dichotomies. We've got the thing about the biological reductionism versus the kind of trans-evolutionary. We've got this, which you've just described. We've got the whole basis of the society being both a post-hierarchy, post-scarcity, utopia, which also runs as a strictly hierarchical military command structure with jobs that you get promoted to. People are always talking about money, despite the fact it's not meant to exist. But it somehow, these things which should be flaws, they become its kind of fuel when the right people get a hold of it. People, funnily enough, like Brian Fuller, who did you see that segue?
Well done. Well,
Because he cut his teeth on Deep Space Nine, of course. He was one of the sort of leading junior writers.
Again, having just worked my way through most of DS9, I've come across several episodes where he is one of the writers or sort of one of the story developers, and then somebody else writes a script. And I have to say, his episodes usually stand out as unusually interesting and good compared to what's around them. They genuinely do.
Yeah. Without hyperbole and without sort of
honestly,
he's just a very interesting writer and a very good writer. He has a very odd process, does Brian Fuller, with the way he writes. It's very loose, and he's fascinated by ideas and images, and he tries his best to throw them at the wall, really, to see if they work. I mean, we're here to talk. We're finally at the end of season 1. We're finally at the end of season 1 of Hannibal.
Yes,
and
here we are.
We've done it. We're at the end of season 1. Saveroux, right? Saveroux, the episode that made me fall in love with the whole damn show, just so deeply, because I think I realized watching this episode what it was trying to do and where it was willing to go. It was willing to go. It was not beholden to any of the previous texts or adaptations of those texts. It was going to do its own thing and explore its own ideas and be quite flagrant with regards to Thomas Harris's material, to the point of completely inverting it.
Well, it goes back to that thing that I think Jack mentioned in our last episode, which is the joy and the when people can get into someone else's text, and dig out certain things about it, deconstruct it, reconstruct it in a new way. That's the more of that, please.
Absolutely.
And Hannibal is a very good example of it. Very good example of it.
But what I love about this episode in particular is it's such an experiment. They didn't know. I mean, this is true of every season of Hannibal, by the way. Every season of Hannibal was always shaky in terms of whether it was going to be produced at all. This first season, obviously, is an enormous experiment that almost didn't happen for lots of different reasons. The copyright for this franchise is all over the damn place. Some people own these characters, other people own these characters, and it's just crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So they didn't know if they were going to get a season 2 at all. So as a result, they were writing as though they weren't, with the hope, an eye towards getting a season 2. But they were writing as though they weren't, which is why Saveroux is this brilliant piece of work that culminates the thesis of season 1. All of this wonderful sort of cross-pollination of the characters we've been getting, all of this mirroring that we've discussed in previous episodes, all of it comes to a head here, but it leaves it open for the notion of a season 2, the idea of a season 2. But if it ended here, there were no season 2. It would be okay, right?
It would be fine, because like the continuance of the story is just implicit, because we know, and we've talked before about stories that for some reason gain traction in our culture to the point where people become, at least a certain amount of people become so familiar with their outlines that they're taking on the contours of myth. We talked about this with Dracula. Like, you can show people in Western culture a young Victorian gentleman in a coach at night going up a mountain, and a hell of a lot of them, probably most of them, are going to say, that's Jonathan Harker.
It's Jonathan Harker for Dracula.
Sans any other context, right? Hannibal is getting there. I mean, there's no coincidence. As another thing we talked about in multiple episodes of this series is that there are many Dracula resonances with Hannibal. And people know that Hannibal will eventually be in the Baltimore State Mental Hospital for the criminally insane, talking to Clarice Starling, basically. So they know that that's where this is ultimately going. So you can end season 1 on this complete, I mean, technically speaking, it's an unhappy ending, or technically speaking, depending on how you look at it, technically speaking, it's a cliffhanger. But at the same time, firstly, it feels very satisfyingly whole. Like, one of the things I noticed about Saveroux on this rewatch is how much it closes the loop with the beginning of the series, especially with they go back to the Hobbs house, and the whole way in which the shooting of Will by Jack at the Hobbs house mirrors the shooting of Hobbs in the same place, exactly the same place, by Will in the early part of the series. And the dialogue mirrors itself. It's said right the way around into this beautiful circle.
Honestly,
so it feels closed. It feels like a closed loop. But it also, because we know that there's more story than this, because we know the myth, we know the legend, we have that central sort of mythic idea in our head of Hannibal Lecter behind bars talking to Clarice Starling. We all know that there's more to it than this. But at the same, that's why it can end on this apparently paradoxical subversion of everything that should be happening, so to speak, if this were in fact CSI Baltimore, as it's often pretended to be, and still feel whole, and still feel complete.
I mean, just aesthetically alone, that sequence, I know we're sort of skipping right to the end here, but that final sequence of Hannibal doing Clarice Starling's walk down that corridor in the Baltimore State Hospital, in order for that to work, in order for that to have the resonance that it does, it relies on exactly what you're talking about there, Jack. We need to know, as the audience, we need to understand that the shot is echoing those shots from Silence of the Lambs. So it's not just knowing the myth, it's knowing the adaptations of the myth, or that spawned certain images that are relevant to the myth, in order for that to work and have the resonance that it does. I remember watching that and thinking, they're not. Thinking, they're not doing this. They're not going.
But in order to... This is what's so clever about it, because by subverting it, it recalls that which is being subverted, and that which is being subverted, because it is mythic, it closes that loop.
Yeah. And it's very pleasing on an ironic level as well, isn't it? It gives you this sense of, oh, I recognize this, but at the same time, it's so subverted and it's perverse. It becomes pleasantly perverse. Apparently, the scene was going to be longer. There was supposed to be some of the dialogue that's in Kaiseki was supposed to be in the final sequence of this episode. But Brian Fuller saw it and thought, no. It works so much better if you just have the emulation of the dialogue between Clarice and Hannibal. Hello, Dr. Lecter. It's beautiful. It's absolutely, and of course you also, I mean, just on a personal level, you get the playing of Vide Cormeum, which is happening in Hannibal's head. There's a brilliant thing Mads does when he just enters the corridor, where he closes his eyes and he just nods his head slightly, and it's like he's the maestro. Vide Cormeum starts playing behind his eyes.
We've established that Hannibal is aware of the text that he's in, and he's aware of his other textual iterations. There's the scene in, I believe, Fromage after the fight with whatever the guy's name is, the serial killer that kills people with catgut, where he arranges the scene, as a tableau, and then he signs it with on his harpsichord the first note of the aria from Bach's Goldberg Variations. So he's done this before.
Yes, he creates the the non-diegetic
isn't it?
music in his own show.
Yes, I think that's kind of it. It's almost where it's going. You know, it's the fact. I mean, and I think this episode is where it really starts to tip over into metaphysics. There are certain things in this episode that don't necessarily make sense unless you look at the metaphysics of the show holistically. So you talked earlier, Jack, about how there's this wonderful loop where Will and Hannibal are returned to the site of Garrett Jacob Hobbs' killing, where he kind of inflicted the first death upon his daughter. All characters in the show die multiple times, by the way. Death is really an interesting thing in the show. Characters suffer symbolic death, and when they reach a particular point, they almost like transcend. They move on to a different plane. So Abigail's first death is inflicted by her father when he almost cuts her throat. They return there under the auspices that Will has inflicted a more terminal emulation of that death upon her. And then when Will is shot by Crawford, he emulates Garrett Jacob Hobbs's dialogue. He doesn't say to anybody in particular, he says see. And when Hobbs says that in the first episode, it doesn't really make sense. It's quite confusing. It's an anarchic scene anyway, so you don't really, you're not left with much time to ponder it. But it makes sense when you realize what's going on, when you look at the cross-pollination of the characters, the way that this is. It's a mythic text. It's a poetic text. It's a text that's aware of itself as myth, as poetry, and because of the cross-pollination of the characters, it's almost like this version of Will, which is no one anymore. It's this strange culmination of lots of different characters. It's echoing back. It's so wonderful. I love it.
That's what you called it in the private chat, which is just sort of a backwards echo through time.
Yeah.
Which, as I keep banging on about in these episodes, it's like the Todorov's hesitation almost collapsing again. That happening almost again. But the thing you said, it's like a poem, and it's absolutely right. It's like the poem Vide cum meum, which means see my heart, and that's from Dante, where he's having a dream of Beatrice, where he's dreaming about her seeing him, and this is what this is all about. It's all about people seeing each other. That's what Hannibal wants Will to do. He wants Will to see his heart.
Yeah, he does, and he's willing to die for it. That's what's so interesting. He doesn't. I mean, he is in sort of metatextual terms. He's the master of this particular story. He's kind of writing it, so maybe on that level, he does know. But he doesn't necessarily know that Crawford's going to walk through the door in time and stop Will from killing him. He's quite happy to be seen, and that's it. That pleases him. Mm. It's I mean, for me, it's a moment. It's one of the moments in Hannibal. There are several coming up, but it's hot. I'm sorry, it's hot. It's really romantic. It's really beautiful. It's twisted, it's perverse, and what he's done to Will is appalling and abusive. But I cannot deny
the intensity of the emotion makes it, erotic just by itself.
Honestly, it does. And I mean, Du Maurier says when Crawford and other psychiatrist, what's her name?
Bloom.
Yes, Bloom. When they go to visit her to fight because Will's taken Hannibal and they want to know where he is and whatnot, she says to them both, if anyone can help Will, it's Hannibal. Mm. And again, it's perversely true. It's perversely true because yes, Hannibal does want Will to see him. That is part of his project. Absolutely, he is so oddly in love with this guy, and he just wants to be seen. There's something very intense and beautiful about that. But it's not that selfish either. He wants Will to see himself. What he sees in Will is potential. He sees this man who is this unique work of art, whose mind is unlike anything, whose soul is unlike anything else in all the world, unlike anything else in all of humanity, possibly in the history of humanity. And he wants him to be more. He wants him to explode out of this sort of buttoned-down meat, caged by his own morality and the impositions that have happened upon him. He wants him to be beautiful. And this is part of it, this breaking down of everything that he trusts and everything that he knows about himself.
But I think this episode is where the act of seeing or the act of looking becomes very explicit because, as we've said, there's been mirroring, a mirror, and in a sense, Will is trapped between mirrors by the end of this story. But a mirror is useless without the act of looking. And one of the, I think, the really powerful elements in this episode is the moment when everyone turns away from Will. They stop looking at him, with the exception of Hannibal. So you have all those people who've worked with him who now can't make eye contact with him. They can't make. You get that confirmation of an idea that, despite what the first episode, the pilot episode, said about Asperger's and autism, Will Graham's empathic abilities, as we've been saying, they run so deep, they're so unique, that it's no wonder he's terrified of looking at people, because it's the windows of the soul and all that of his friends and colleagues. But what's interesting in this episode, what really, again, it's the rhyming, it's the mirroring, it's now they think he's been murdering and mutilating all over the shop. They can't bear to look at his eyes. And I just found that particular section fascinating, how we do, as human beings, as people, turn away from people who have transgressed in some way, betrayed or done something truly awful. The whole psychology of looking, the gaze, the permission around it, being invited to communicate, is really distilled into that moment where no one can look at Will, and Will has never been able to look at anyone.
No.
So he
can't even look at himself anymore.
And he can't look at himself.
He can't even look at himself now.
So the only person who is looking is Hannibal. And again, as we've often said about Hannibal, this goes beyond morality, this goes beyond good and evil. He becomes a strangely heroic character for all his machinations, for all his manipulations, because he is willing to look at Will, and now no one else is.
Yeah, absolutely. Will at his worst, ostensibly at his worst, at his most degraded. I mean, okay, Hannibal's put him there technically.
Hannibal's put him there, absolutely, but Hannibal's revealed something. He's revealed the fragility of the faith between mortal men and women, of course, which he is not, and it's basically not there. They turn away from him so fast. And
despite the fact, it's particularly with regards to Crawford and Alana, there's so much.
And Alana's is purely guilt. Alana's
purely, honestly, it's purely.
I mean,
guilt.
Jack, I think his manifests in a slightly different way, but she just resorts to denial when Will is in the frame. I mean, the guilt, the looking after the house and the dogs.
Yeah.
And of course but what is interesting finally is that, she is this character who's been somewhat enigmatic across an entire season. We've not been sure what to make of her. And in fact, I think all three of us have perhaps reversed our opinions about her in from our previous viewings to this viewing. But she is, of course, key to unlocking Hannibal's plans for Will. She does the clock test. She understands the result. She gets the explanation from Hannibal that is obviously a lie, but which might be just enough to get the first domino rocking. And of course, the brilliance of that whole plot device, the clock drawing, is that, of course, in most drama, that's your Chekhov's gun right there. But what I love about this episode is, and the ones around it, is here it's not quite that, because it's pretty much put aside.
Yeah.
It's going to be instead, and I think this is what Fuller is very good at, it's the concatenation of small things that end up providing the context for every reversal. And it will provide, of course, the context for a big reversal as we go into season 2.
Absolutely. And it also symbolically kind of sets up the metaphysics of season 2 as well. I mean, we're going to get all this stuff about the broken teacup, which is key to the way Hannibal understands the universe. And the clock, the broken clock, is symbolic of that.
Yeah,
it's symbolic of that, and also of the fact that Will himself is now broken and shattered. He is the broken teacup, metaphorically. The universe doesn't make sense anymore to him.
And the universe as being something which is, if not governed, then at least lashed to both clocks and screens. And screens being mirrors, it's all suddenly really relevant, isn't it?
Yeah.
Windows. That's another big one. Of course, Windows, I mean, Alana never really tumbles to Hannibal until the moment when she is shoved out of a window, and basically becomes the Shattered Cup herself.
Yeah, the Shattered Cup.
Well, that's also, I mean, I was talking earlier about the symbolic deaths that these characters suffer. I mean, we'll get to it. Season 2 is all about this, but that is one of hers. That's one of hers. In fact, I mean, when we get to it, we'll get to it. But at the end of season 2, all of the characters die. All of them do. To shift them into season 3, you know, which
that's one of the things. I remember writing this about Hannibal season 3 when it started. I remember writing, this is a show that was actually sort of smashed to pieces at the end of its second season, trying to reassemble itself. Yeah, and that's what happens.
that's exactly what happens.
You know, yeah, it destroys them all basically.
Where
except
it
Hannibal.
reassembles itself is in a
destroys
completely
the
non-literal universe. I mean, the geography doesn't make any sense. Nothing. It's pure. It's almost. I mean, you mentioned Dante's Inferno, Jack, but it's almost Orpheus and Eurydice by that point as well. I mean, it's like it's in its own underworld. Well, I mean, same for Dante's Inferno. But I'm just thinking of. I think probably what's clouding my thinking here is the Jean Cocteau version, which of course is all about mirrors.
Yeah, and we've seen references to that myth in previous episodes as well.
Yeah.
Another thing that this episode begins, I believe, the Saveroux, I mean, begins the thing in the Baltimore State Hospital for the Criminally Insane of inmates being probably Gideon. Abel Gideon is seen in one of these before this, actually. Now I come to think of it.
Tanks,
but in the tanks, in the shark tanks, basically. But it's interesting that the emphasis on bars, it goes out of its way to show bars in a way that it doesn't need to. The original Silence of the Lambs has Hannibal behind glass. They have him behind glass in latest in season 3. They go out of their way to put Will behind bars, to put Will in the shark tank thing, and bars are another image that Dante liked to use. Seeing through the bars, seeing through the bars of the cage.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's apt. I mean, the visuals of this episode are something else. I mean, actually, I do think that the visual flair of the show will kick into overdrive when we get to season 2. I think it gets better and better and better on a visual level. But this is the beginning of that. Clearly, I get the feeling that because they didn't really know they were getting a season 2, they just threw everything at this. Everything.
That's the white season, as I seem to remember season 2 in my head, because I mean this is only my second time through, as I've said. I always think of season 1 as the blue season, season 2 is the white season, and season 3 is the strangely yellowy green, almost absinthe green season. But
synesthesia there.
Absolutely.
I
3 colors red.
I think you're
3 colors blue, 3 colors white.
Yes, but you are taking your cues from a careful use of palette, I think.
Oh, very much so. The very sophisticated color coding, and
I mean, this episode is darkness, isn't it? It's darkness. Almost everything is chiaroscuro. It's all darkness and shadow up until the very end. Yeah, it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
Yeah, darkness and mirrors and bars and underground chambers and there is an element of openness about the end of this one, which is it's clearly been left there to be picked up later, which is particularly the fate of Abigail. Like, I think we are meant to implicitly understand that Will didn't kill her. Right. I mean, it's not certain. The way season 1 has gone up to this point, it could be that Will killed her.
That would have been an interesting twist, wouldn't it? That would have been an interesting twist. I mean, it would have complicated things a bit more.
I feel like on the whole, as you watch the end of season 1, that's not meant to be your main suspicion. I think you're meant to think that Hannibal has killed her. I mean, they leave the end of the previous episode is Abigail looking up at Hannibal with realization.
Yes.
Yeah. But there is the open question of, well, what exactly happened? And that's particularly focused, of course, on the ear. You know,
And
how
interestingly,
did her, which isn't answered until the following season. They leave that apparently inexplicable element. Will coughs up Abigail's severed ear. They leave that completely unanswered. And if they hadn't had a season 2, that would have just been left completely unanswered.
And in fact, the fate of Abigail, which of course you don't get to see until season 3, what actually happened to her, you don't get to see until season 3.
You see, I think it's an odd clue, that it's an ear, because I think given the weight placed on eyes and looking and seeing, and he should have coughed up an eye. But I think it's a clue. It's a clue that she's not dead.
Interesting. Yeah, I like that. I do,
because the rhyme is for him to cough up an eye.
It's fascinating because, like, you also have in this episode Hannibal's. Is it this episode or is it Kaiseki where you get the mourning for Abigail? It's this episode, isn't it? You get the mourning for Abigail in his session with Bedelia, and he's playing it completely straight. He's playing it completely sincere. And again, I think it's another example of Hannibal's complexity because I think he is sincere. He is sincere, even though, as I don't want to spoil anything, but those of us who've watched the show know things are more complicated than what they seem to be. Let's just say that. And he's mourning her death in a symbolic manner. Yeah. That version of Abigail is gone, has been destroyed, is dead. On a metaphysical level.
The idea of multiple deaths, each character.
Exactly, on a metaphysical level. She is gone. That version of her is gone. I mean, Abigail in season 2, again, when we get to it, we'll get to it. There's a lot to discuss about her in season 2. She's kind of like, she's almost like a linchpin. She's the symbolic marker of the path to the world of the dead in season 2. It's really fascinating. But here, she's become entirely ethereal because she doesn't occur at all here, apart from her blood on the ground. She's become an idea. She's become a ghost. Just like Garrett Jacob Hobbs, her father, is a ghost. Just like Will is now a ghost. And just like this version of Hannibal is a ghost that's eroding in Will's eyes. I mean, I love the way that sequence, by the way, where they are on their way to Garrett Jacob Hobbs's house. You can see subconsciously, it's all in Hugh Dancy's performance, actually. You can see that subconsciously Will's working it through. The reason he went to Hannibal is not because Hannibal is his friend or because he trusts Hannibal. He's getting it. He's starting to get it.
Mm-hmm. He definitely plays it as knowing before he knows, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. And the realization is the most wonderful thing. It's beautifully played.
I think it's like he knows at that point that it's either him or Hannibal, and he's almost hoping that it is him.
Yes. Because like everyone else, he's put Hannibal on a pedestal, hasn't he? Like, this is the way Hannibal works, right? He loves Hannibal so much, which he does, because Hannibal, I mean, we talk about Hannibal building up walls and being so alone and wanting to be seen. Well, Will wants that too, because Will is also isolated and alone, but he deludes himself into thinking that it's his choice, and we know that's not true. Because when Alana comes into his life, suddenly he's making romantic overtures to her. Suddenly he can't leave this alone, this thing that's giving him a social circle. And he certainly can't leave Hannibal alone. The notion that Hannibal could be the mastermind behind all of this is crushing to him. It's very surprising. And
we're talking about family now, aren't we? We're talking about found family. I mean, the bit where Hannibal mourns for Abigail, you can interpret that in various ways. You can interpret that as Hannibal with foreknowledge of what happens later in the series. You can interpret that as him already having decided at some point he's going to have to kill her, and mourning the necessity of that, or something like that. Or you can interpret it, and I think this is closer to the way I'd go, which is that he's mourning the death of the Abigail who was, quote unquote, given what she did beforehand, quote unquote, innocent. That is to say, the Abigail who hadn't seen him. And who, because that's interesting as well, isn't it? Because self-revelation and other people seeing yourself in the other person's eye,
Yeah,
I mean that is the essence of
It
empathy.
runs right throughout this, doesn't it?
Yeah,
so
and it
does,
is something
so
that
does.
Hannibal leads Abigail to, just as he leads Will to.
Yeah,
But at the same time, the minute Abigail knows, then that version of their relationship, and we've talked before about that relationship being built on mutual lies. Hannibal is lying to Abigail, Abigail is lying to Hannibal, and they're both pretending to believe each other's lies about who they are. And yet there is a sweetness. It's a kind of a game or a performance or play acting that they're engaging in together. But there is a kind of a sincere sweetness about that version of relationship, as much as it's based on lies and pretense. It is essentially, because we've talked about Abigail as a surrogate daughter. That's a huge part of childhood, isn't it? That sort of the play acting of. I mean, children, just like every other human being, spend a huge amount of time performing a self that is expected of them or required of them by other people, and they perform innocence. And adults mourn. I've never been a parent myself, so there's a limited extent that I can talk about this. But my impression is that parents, they do mourn what is conventionally called the loss of innocence as the child grows up. And I think what's probably being talked about there is the performance of innocence is dropped.
That's it. That's it, exactly. It's also it's children becoming their own people. That's what it is. It's children becoming their own identities.
They start performing for different people. They start choosing a different performance.
It's the dark side of parenthood and the dynamics. We've spoken about this before. It's the dark side of the dynamics, the unspoken dynamics between parents and children, which is, of course, that parents largely kind of resent their children for growing up and becoming their own people, and have a real problem with it. And many parents can't move on. They can't develop in the same way, funnily enough, that the parent figures largely in this show can't. So Bloom and Crawford, the parent figures to Will, can't handle the fact
they
that their child
effectively end up going to therapy, don't they, together? Although it's framed as an inquiry.
Yeah, right.
And boy, they tearing lumps out of each other. Or she's tearing lumps out of him, and he's trying to be the stoic paternalistic.
The impulse to reassemble the sundered family, though, is so strong, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we're moving on to Kaiseki now, one of the most charming moments in Kaiseki is a bit where Hannibal talks to Bedelia about, I got to be Will Graham today, because he's kind of been adopted as the new. I mean, Beverly actually calls him the new Will Graham. He takes over Will's
he's like
position.
a kid in a sweet shop.
The adopted child that's been accepted. It's like Harry at Hogwarts. And that's what's happening subtextually, is that this family unit that has been sundered is trying to reassemble itself. Hannibal is entering into the performance again, the performance of being Will Graham, and in so doing, he's allowing this group of people to sort of reconstruct this family relationship.
The rhyming and the cross season reconstruction of the narrative framework. It's exactly the same story, only we've substituted Will for Hannibal for Will, and so on and so on. It's wonderful because we know by this point we're on our way to knowing something of Hannibal's scattershot intention, because it's not singular. And he's finding it, which of course has made this more interesting to watch than if he were kind of Machiavel. But it's also this. He does partly want to be Will. He wants to mesh with him by taking his job, feeling what it's like to be in his world, while he can continue to probe the Will. Will we know by seeing what makes him tick on those visits to Chilton's. I mean, it's perfect for him. He protects him.
Will is one of
in
the
this series
on Earth who Hannibal feels is worthy of him. He is almost equal to him on a certain level, and so being able to be him, being able to step into his role is a joy. It's so sincere. It's one of the few times where you see Hannibal kind of unmasked in his delight, in his happiness, and disarmed by it. I think he's quite surprised too. It's certainly the way Mads plays it. There's a glee, there's a childishness to him at that point, and it is I remember seeing that scene for the first time and laughing out loud.
Mm.
Just laughing out loud.
It's
at
so
how
charming, isn't it? Yeah,
lethal.
it's,
It's
it's so
lovely.
little
There's-
boy charming.
Yeah,
It's
very
what I
sweet.
love as well. He's sort of dressed inappropriately as well because he's dressed as Hannibal dresses. He's not quite adapted to the new role yet, and you know you get these things where
Yeah.
he's sort of gingerly stepping around because he's got a very very expensive pair of shoes on.
It's like in the first episode of a new series after a regeneration, the new Doctor is wearing the previous Doctor's clothes.
It's
you know,
exactly
he's
that,
still
isn't it? They've
picks his own costume.
just changed it somewhat. He's trying to behave as if he were wearing the old clothes, but of course he's got these other ones on, and it's great. It's and of course he plays it so well. He's got such a he's got the little comedic details as well. But
Oh
what
my
I
God,
what
he's
I
got
love
some
about
CPR.
this is that this whole episode, and it's one of the joys of rewatching things and reevaluating them, I guess, was how it sort of exploded an idea that had sort of persisted in my mind from my very first watching of it, which was that the Hamlet thing, really, how much is Hannibal pretending and how much is authentic? For example, did Hannibal always plan to get Will in the frame, possibly with the intention of releasing further revelations in him about his potential, about his abilities, or or meshing with him? And then you suddenly realize that's actually not really the tack at all. That's not important. We're in a completely different place. Those things actually don't matter. We don't need to have answers to those things because Hannibal is constructing so much of the narrative anyway that these points become somewhat moot about whether it's authentic or whether it's intentional. It is and it isn't. Sometimes he's in over his head and he's improvising, and sometimes it feels scrupulously worked out. But he's finding his way through.
Absolutely, and loving every moment of it. He's having fun. He's enjoying.
It's a bit like the question of what would have happened at the end of Saveroux if Jack hadn't turned up. Well, something would have happened, wouldn't it? Hannibal would have played the hands that were dealt him at that round of the game. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
and that makes it more interesting as drama as well. Just to take it to slightly more prosaic concerns, just as a piece of drama, that is far more interesting to watch. Than coming down on a side.
Oh yeah, absolutely. If he were just, like Jack said, if he were just Machiavellian, it would be boring. It would be dull. He would just be a supervillain, wouldn't he? He would just be a supervillain, and you'd be building towards the inevitable revelation, and then that would be it, and blah 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 blah. It would be dull. But because he is so complex, because you can't really get a bead on his agendas or designs as such, in the same way that Will can't in Saveroux, right? Will says to him at the end of Saveroux, "You were so hard to see. You were so hard to see because you don't have any definable motivation. What is this?
Yeah.
You are." Hannibal is such a puzzle to him.
He's in a way, he is a sort of curious blank, and yet he isn't. And yeah,
he's full of things, right? He's full of everything. That's the paradox of Hannibal.
But I guess it's it's in that mythological framework that he's not one of us, therefore he cannot be seen. I mean, we're back to Paradise Lost again, where he can't quite be seen.
That's right.
And the show, we're back to Shakespeare as well. We're back to possibly the most loathsome villain in all of Western literature, Iago, who says, "I am not what I am."
Yeah, yeah.
And who has no motive. I mean, famously, Iago has no motive. It's almost a cliche to say that. And Iago spends the entire play trying to work out what his motive is, and spinning various theories to us and ourselves about what is. Yeah,
in that where he's basically he doesn't know, and he's trying motivations on as if they were garments. It's
what he fundamentally is, of course, like all Shakespeare's great villains, is he's an actor. And that's talking previously in this about performance, about how so much of our social life, I mean, this goes, Judith Butler, blah 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 blah, is just performance. We perform selves for others.
Well, back to what we were saying about the children earlier,
yes, absolutely.
Childish innocence,
and
performance.
This idea of the person who is able to harness that consciously and use it against others, that is so key to the figure of the psychological villain. It's Richard III. Richard III is all about
is a classic example.
performance. Iago is all about performance, and that is absolute. And Milton's Lucifer. We were talking a little while ago, weren't we, about Paradise Lost?
Yeah.
So much of what Milton's Lucifer is doing, if you read certainly those early sections, is performing for his troops.
Yeah,
that's it. Yes, he internalizes that. At the beginning of Paradise Lost, he internalizes that.
Yeah.
There are sequences where
he finds a rationale, not a motivation. He finds a rationale, a rationalization, and he internalizes it.
Yeah. Because he's desolate at that point. That version of Lucifer is desolate. He realizes that he's lost and that it's over. But he also realizes he's got legions of demons that he led into their damnation. And
I mean, let's face it.
Give them something.
He's got to give them something.
Yeah, it's
there
wonderful.
is a sense in which all these, and what this is subtextually, is a quest for personhood. With certainly with the Shakespearean villains, with Richard and Iago, less so with Macbeth, because Macbeth is about sort of a man with interiority that is unstable, who loses his interiority through his own sort of, his actions lead him to a kind of moral annihilation, a kind of moral horror leading to a moral annihilation. But very much with Richard and Iago, it is about people who have a fundamental absence, a nullity, a nothingness at the core of their being. And they are searching for something to fill that gaping hole. And they fill it with performance after performance after performance. And what they're actually doing is sort of, they're cramming people into their own gaping maw. And now we're back at cannibalism, and we are a long way away. I mean, this is what these guys do. Iago, and particularly Richard, because he gets through more people. But they are like these great big gaping mouths that just consume people. And we're a long way from the actual psychopathology of like crime in this series. But the psychopathology of cannibalism is the attempt to internalize people. It's about trying to, I mean, again, it's all about power and control, obviously, and domination. But that's not how they experience it internally. You know, they experience it as a yearning for contact and intimacy. That's what Dennis Nielsen thought to himself. He thought, I'm looking for love.
Absolutely, yes.
But you get certainly one of the because it's a case of rhyming, one of the real stark differences in talking about Richard and Macbeth is, as often happens in Shakespeare, of course, this happens with all writers, is that he gives both characters almost the same speech about I'm so much in blood, and yet the perspective of when Macbeth says it compared to Richard is so striking. Nothing exposes their differences as characters quite like the fact that they almost have the same speech. And Macbeth's is so devastating because you realize that when he says to go back would be as tedious as go o'er, it resonates in such a more profound human way, because he has had that interiority annihilated, whereas it's a very different concern when Richard basically says the same thing.
Well, it's funny you bring that up, Elliot, because again, I mean, that's something this show does all the time, right? We've spoken about this so many times before, but the show has this penchant for taking lines from previous versions of these stories or previous adaptations of these stories, putting them into different characters' mouths, changing them slightly around and revealing different emphases of them. And these two episodes are rife with it. They're absolutely rife with it. And for my money,
sticks out to me. Sorry, go on, please.
No, go on, Jack.
Well, I was just going to mention the one that gets given to Chilton, because Chilton gets given the withering line that Hannibal has about him in, I believe, Red Dragon. Hannibal describes Chilton as fumbling at his brain like a college freshman at a panty girdle. And in I believe Kaiseki, Chilton is given that line. He is allowed to use that analogy about himself with reference to Will. And it's partly sort of him, he's sort of saying that's how Will sees me, but he's also displaying he's displaying a level of self-awareness there.
Yeah, it's kind of
the
how
book
everyone
children
sees
simply
it,
would
isn't
not
it?
be capable of. Yeah.
No, it's what we spoke about before, isn't it? This version of Chilton, like all the characters, is so much more complex and interesting than any previous version or incarnation. He does
so
have
much
a
more.
degree of self-awareness. He's a shitbag, he's a shyster, but he knows it. And of course, we see it again when he's he's talking to Will when he's in the dunking cage, and Will says to him, "It makes me feel like you're lobbing softballs, hoping for a splash." And Chilton says, "Well, you're in my hospital. I've got many more balls to lob.
Yeah.
He's effectively acknowledging, yeah, I'm terrible at this. I'm terrible at what I'm doing. But you know what? Doesn't matter. I've got time."
Yeah, in the end.
Yeah.
Interesting.
It's
That
almost-
whole method of scrambling lines from a pre-existing text and trying them on for size in the mouths of different characters. Probably my earliest realization of that being done was in a version of Macbeth, and that's Orson Welles' Macbeth. When I cottoned on to the fact that he's putting different characters' lines in the mouths of other characters to see the effect it has on the story and on the intentions of everyone. Just a little aside, but this does the same thing. It's taking things from Harris and redeploying lines, as you say. And it's like having just spoken about Shakespeare, having just spoken about Richard III and Macbeth. It's Orson Welles, who I think is my earliest memory of coming into contact with an artist doing that.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because this show does it with everything. It doesn't just do it with character, with lines. It does it with characters as well. One of the things people often ask about the show is,
Orson Welles' Macbeth does, because he creates a character that's not in the original text to take some of these lines.
Yes, that's it. I mean,
it's extraordinary. Yeah.
One of the things people ask of this show is, where is Clarice Starling? And I always say, well, she's everywhere.
She's everywhere.
She's everywhere. Yeah. There are characters, numerous characters that are invested with elements of Clarice Starling, that have Clarice Starling's lines. And there are certain characters that actually, they are versions of Clarice Starling with different names. So we've already had Miriam Lass, who is the most obvious version, a very different incarnation of Starling in the sense that she is a victim character, which is not the Clarice Starling from the book or the films. Bedelia is Clarice Starling. Bedelia is Clarice from the end of the book Hannibal. He's the corrupted version of Clarice Starling that we see at the end of the book Hannibal, but done well. Which
and of course, there's a lovely full circle there, because ironically, Vicky, when we had the lockdown. I think I was saying this to Jack a while back in one of our chats, or maybe we were talking about it ourselves. I can't remember. But I had basically got the X-Files cheap, because I remembered that back in the day I'd only ever seen the second half of the first season and the first half of the second season go out. Nice. I never saw anything else. So I watched it during the lockdown a few years ago, but I didn't watch it with Vicky. She was busy doing something else. But she said, I haven't seen the X-Files since the 90s. So we watched the pilot about a week ago. And of course, I was cackling away because it is Gillian Anderson. It is Bedelia du Maurier. Yeah. And the whole of the first scene is constructed as if she's Clarice. And she goes down into the basement and finds Mulder, who's basically Hannibal.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's all riffing on that Silence of the Lambs confrontation, where she goes to corridor. She meets with her superiors. Fox Mulder. Yeah, we've got to tell about. And there's a very loaded conversation about his abilities and the worries around him, and that he's spooky, that he's strange. And then she's led down into the basement, and she comes. It is the opening, and of course, Scully, in terms of X-Files lore and the construction of the X-Files, Scully is Clarice Starling as well.
She's Clarice Starling.
She is Clarice
the
Starling,
archetype, right?
She looks like her. Yeah, Gillian Anderson is her again, but in the context of Hannibal. So you're getting all these mirrors.
absolutely. It's so weird, isn't it? And also, I mean, she is the version of Clarice that is. She's ascended in certain ways, or descended, depending on your perspective. She's the corrupted version of Clarice, which I mean, in the book, I fucking hate, by the way. I hate it so much because it doesn't make any sense in the book. It actually, in the book, it fundamentally undermines the basis of Clarice and Hannibal's relationship. He tells her,
it's so bizarre.
The book, it's so bizarre. The book version.
It's one of those things where you genuinely wonder what the fuck he was thinking.
Honestly, I don't know. He must. I don't know what was going on in his mind when he wrote that. I mean, even the film version of Hannibal says, "Yeah, we're not doing that. We're going to change the ending because that doesn't make any sense." The film.
I mean, I think Hannibal, for most of its runtime, Hannibal the book, for most of its page time, whatever the equivalent expression is one of it's one of the more interesting of the books. Yeah. It's not any better written, but it's got it's kind of florid and interesting in its full out Grand Guignol weirdness. The book, but the end is catastrophic. It's catastrophic. It's one of the few examples of an ending that is so bad that it comprehensively ruins what has been up to that point a fairly interesting text. The film is much better.
It's much better. I actually quite like the film, if I'm perfectly honest. I rather like the film.
Yeah.
But the book, I remember reading the book for the first time. I was 15, and I was just
across the room. I got to that bit and I could not believe what I was reading. I was sat there going, no, like that. And I got to the point where I realized that it was actually happening. It sort of it penetrated my brain that what I was reading was actually there. And I just I chucked the book away. No.
My reaction wasn't that violent, but I do recall, because I was like 15, just when you're starting to really develop your critical faculties. And I remember reading it and going to my mom, who'd lent me her copy of the book, and saying that ending was shit, wasn't it? It was really awful.
It's incomprehensible.
It is incomprehensible.
It would make more sense if the book ended with aliens suddenly landing and attacking Baltimore.
What we know of Clarice up until that point, the way she's written up until that point, it just. The volte-face of the character, it makes no sense whatsoever. But interesting, what this show has done is taken the archetype, taken the idea, and created an entire character out of it, where you don't get that baggage, so it works much, much better. And in fact, I mean, Bedelia may be one of my favorite characters in the show Hannibal. Much of that may be due to Gillian Anderson's performance, because I think she's spectacular. I mean, gay guy, reason. So everyone, all of us have got I've got our exceptions. I've got our reasons for turning. Yeah, Gillian might be one. But yeah, she's absolutely wonderful. But funny enough, Kaiseki, the episode, does this. It's really strange. It has this quality of playing with its audience, because by this point, of course, they know what they're doing. They know what the show is. It's not experimenting in the same way that the first season is. They know what their audience are thinking and what they're assuming. So Kaiseki plays with the audience in the sense that it tries to play that it's a great reset, that it's gone back to the serial killer of the week format, and it's just going to have Hannibal in Will's shoes now, right? And it's not going to do that.
No.
It's not going to do that, and it's not doing that. There are so many subtle little things happening. I mean, you said it earlier, Jack, in the text chat we were having, where this feels like it's half of a story. It's like it's the first half of a much longer story. That's kind of true of the entirety of season 2.
But also that you were talking about the playing with expectation, and that this text is now it's heading towards myth. It's heading towards mythology. That it makes that 12 weeks later conceit so brilliant, because the whole series has run on being aware that a portion of the audience comes to it knowing at least the basic thrust of the narrative. As we talk about the young Victorian gentleman in the coach, it's got to be Jonathan Harker, and therefore how these characters operate. Now it takes that even further, right at the top of the season, which means it's not just a great hook in television terms, but given as we were as we are now, very much in that kind of spoiler culture, even when this was broadcast. So it's already subversive to have a show where we're all ahead.
Oh, it's brilliant.
And then the issue doesn't then become what will be revealed, but how do the various events and characters click into place for these reveals to even work? And I think the extra value of that is it helps its capacity to be rewatched, because we're not in a Kaiser Sose situation where the whole film rests on not knowing the identity.
Twist,
once you know it, you never have to see that film again.
Exactly that.
And once you know it, you realise that you shouldn't have watched it in the first place.
You shouldn't have watched it in the first place because it's absolute dross.
But it doesn't make any fucking sense. What are we even watching? What are we watching?
Exactly.
What have I been watching for 2 hours?
And so it really helps. But also it's a nice.
It's so.
I mean, there were a couple of other series that were doing this kind of thing at the time, and of course, because this show is elevated to a point where it's much more ingrained in the texture of our pop culture. We're so much more aware of it than these other shows. It can be bolder with it than they can. So you realise how timid they are in their flash forwards or their foreshadowings.
I honestly can't believe. I still can't believe the way the first episode, the way the first scene of the second season plays out, which is of course the last scene. It's a truncated version of the last scene,
and it's a brilliant piece of drama as well, because it means you have got to stick with it.
You've got to stick with it. You've got to see how it comes about, right?
I love can't have that dipping in and out thing.
It doesn't even pretend.
It's incredibly.
It doesn't treat its audience like, it doesn't jangle the keys. It doesn't try to divert. It shows you what is going to happen. It's like, we know. Let's make it glorious. Let's make it amazing.
We all know where this is going, and we all know that we know where it's going. As I say, we know the legend, we know the myth, we know that it's going to not end up, because it continues past this, but we know that it's going to get to everybody knowing that Hannibal is a serial killer and he's behind bars and he's being spoken to by Clarice Starling. Again, Clarice in various ways hovers over this through paratextual knowledge, contextual knowledge, because she's so deep in the culture, and the way she, as you've just been talking about, the way she keeps instantiating in various ways in the narrative subtextually. So we know that's where it's going. It has to go there, otherwise it stops being the myth.
Exactly. It becomes something else, doesn't it?
It doesn't. It's fine that we know that. It doesn't need to pretend that it's not doing that. The interest. I mean, it's really an illustration of the fact that storytelling that relies upon surprise, that relies upon that fundamentally and on the most fundamental level relies upon people not knowing what's going to happen. That is just plotless. It is just soap, basically. It is just, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And that's not. This is a myth. It has an arc. It has a place where it's definitely going, and so on and so forth. And we all know that. And it doesn't matter that we know it. The interest is in the journey, not the destination. And this was so of its moment, because round about the time when they were making this, it was ubiquitous. A thing, whether it was a TV episode or a movie, it would start with somebody running down the street being chased, and then it would freeze frame, and a voiceover would come in and say, "You're probably wondering how I got here," and then a thing would come up saying, "24 hours earlier." It was fucking.
Well, certainly bang on this. The one that was really pulling that week to week to week was Breaking Bad.
Breaking Bad, obviously,
doing it as almost to the point of fetishization. It was doing it, but even then,
I've never seen it.
Hannibal comes along and basically goes, "Well, we can go further because we know our audience knows."
That's
so
it.
actually,
it ends with one of those pseudo cliffhangers. Like the first series ends with Will behind bars, identified as the Chesapeake Ripper, and Dr. Hannibal Lecter, innocent, free, coming to visit him in exactly the same way that Clarice visits Hannibal in the myth. So it's the wrong way round.
It's
so
the
we
wrong
know
way.
that it hasn't got where it's going to go. We know that there's more to it, and yet this little foreshadowing, this little jump forward in time that we get at the start of series 2, it ends on a similar sort of cliffhanger, because it shows us that Jack Crawford is going to realize that Hannibal is the Chesapeake Ripper, and they're going to come to blows, something that we all know is going to happen because we know the myth, we know the shape of the myth. But it ends on Jack Crawford apparently trapped and bleeding to death, and Hannibal on his way, just about to break through the door to kill him. So it's
Jack's
still
first
saying
death.
it's his first, but it's still doing the same thing. It's saying, you know, it's going to get here, so here's a little flash forward to what we all know is going to happen. But at the same time, how is this going to fit in? How is this going to end up? That's not. It's not saying where's this going to end up. It's saying how is it going to end up where we all know it has to go in order to make sense.
It's also just a little bit of catharsis for the audience as well, isn't it? You know, it's a release because you've seen Hannibal on top, basically, at the end. He is at the center of his web, and he's playing it like a harp. It's vide cor meum, you know. He is resplendent at that point. You need to see him diminished a little bit, and this series doesn't it do it?
The series never stops doing this either. It ends in exactly the same way, because we know, because Clarice hasn't appeared. We know that if it's going to be the myth, it's going to end up with Hannibal in a cell somewhere being visited by Clarice Starling. So Hannibal doesn't die at the end of series 3. We know he can't possibly die. Yeah. So it ends on a cliffhanger or a cliff faller. Actually, they actually go over the cliff. But we know that can't be the end. It's not to do it before we do it, but it's a beautiful, perfect, complete ending to the series. But we know that it's not the end of the myth.
No, I'm not going to go there because I will just duck basically. So I'm not even going to start on the final episode. But that, oh my god, the fights, the violence between him and Jack in that opening episode, in that opening scene, is incredible.
As sex so often is in this show, it's subtextual. Violence so often is in this show. It's subtextual sex, isn't it? Subtextually, they're banging each other.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, you know, he's not the one Hannibal really wants. It's Will that Hannibal really wants.
Fair play to Lawrence Fishburne. I mean, he's a bit older, he's heavier,
but
he's dealing with a dancer, you know, a trained dancer. And
they
really
both
holds
have
his own.
They both have training in like fight choreography. Obviously,
but
Lawrence
he's
from the Matrix.
Actually pretty nimble for a guy who has such a heavy set guy.
Oh, apparently there is a great bit of footage on YouTube, which is behind the scenes, where they're showing you how they did it and all of the behind the scenes stuff. And it looks like they were having incredible fun. Apparently, they both came out of it really battered and bruised because they kept wanting to make it more violent, more visceral. Let's do this. Let's have this happen. Let me pick him up and sort of like do a wrestling move on him. Let me slam him down onto the deck. And God, does it pay off? It looks amazing. It's one of the, I mean, on a purely prurient aesthetic level, it's just one of the best fight scenes I've ever seen in a TV show.
Well, one of the things I really like about it is that within the chaos, there's these moments. So, for example, there are moments where Jack Crawford pulls FBI-trained moves, which, of course, Hannibal doesn't. He is working from a different tradition, fighting tradition, and seeing those moments where you find structure in their fighting, and then it goes back into chaos.
Yeah.
That's what makes it such a good scene purely from a technical point of view of fighting, is because they keep moving between, oh my god, my life is hanging in the balance, I've got to do something reckless, or I've got to do something extremely violent because my opponent is and then they shift into, you know, known moves, known ways, and Jack's are so different to Hannibal's, and yet they're coalescing as well. It's beautiful, isn't it? Brilliantly put together.
It's so well done. And
at the same time, there is something kind of down and dirty about the way Jack.
Totally down and dirty. Oh yeah,
it's pugilistic, isn't it? It's
they both cheat. I mean, and of course they have to, but I think it's more revealing than just they both cheat because they're both in a life-threatening situation. It hints at character again. It hints at the kind of people they are. The kind of people that Jack Graham, Jack Graham is you. Sorry, Jack Crawford.
Jack Crawford. Yeah,
paging Dr. Freud.
Well, I mean,
But no,
and there's
absolutely.
unspoken communication between them all the way through.
Yes.
That's
All
the
the
thing
way.
I love most about it,
I
because
think
these are
so.
two men who know each other very well. They've dined together, they've laughed together, they know each other so well, and all the way through the fight, you get these moments of, eye contact, and it's something so incredibly intimate and personal about it.
Very much so. Crawford wants to humiliate Hannibal. He doesn't just, I mean, he has the opportunity to really lay Hannibal out a couple of times and he doesn't, because he does something over
Very silly.
Yeah, he wants to
He
humiliate
does
Hannibal.
genuinely get the better of him at least
Yeah.
once.
Yeah.
He does.
Definitely.
He absolutely does. I mean, I think what happens is, and it's beautifully played again, Lawrence Fishburne has some great facial expression, particularly at the beginning of the fight, because he doesn't know. He knows that Hannibal is a serial killer, but he does not know that this meek, kind of like slightly fruity psychiatrist is lethal. He doesn't know that he's a killing machine at this point. He doesn't know that he can fight. And he's surprised. He's caught off guard by it. And you can see the moment in Lawrence Fishburne's face when he's like, right, I am in a life or death
Gotta bring my
situation.
A game.
Yeah, I have got to use everything I've got here. And it's brilliant. It's just so subtly conveyed.
You see just how bloody dangerous Jack Crawford is as well. He gets a knife right through his hand, and he pulls it out, and then he brandishes it at the person that chucked it at him.
Well, the thing is, Hannibal, in a fair fight,
that's fucking tough.
Hannibal can't take him. Jack is stronger than he is. He's a better fighter than he is. And you do get, there is kind of like a mirror, an echo of this fight in season 3. And it's just Jack. It's just Jack. Jack kicks the living shit out of him. Hannibal shouldn't be alive at the end of it. Again, we'll get to it when we get to it, but it is wonderful because it's like the last verse of this song. It really fits beautifully. They've kind of tried to choreograph it so that it echoes and mirrors this fight, but where Hannibal gets one over on Jack at any point, they've counterposed it here, and it's
learned. He's learned from the first one.
I'd say again.
He's learned from the first one.
Exactly that, and also
fool me once, fool me twice, isn't it?
He just knows.
I know you now.
Yeah,
because they've had the most intimate mutual contact. They've been there. They've essentially been lovers in this sort of twisted way.
Yeah. Wow. The emotion. I just loved the fight. I loved it to bits. We were saying earlier as well.
They're both vying to be the Don top, aren't they? But actually, Hannibal's is a verse.
This is it. Hannibal is such a fucking verse. I'm telling you, he is such a verse. Crawford is such a top.
Yeah.
Will, I don't know. I can't get a vibe off Will. It's hard to say. He's mysterious,
Yeah.
They're all with Jack tops from the bottom, but he's generally a sub.
That's what we call a power bottom.
Power bottom. Yeah, he's what have I brought this to? So sorry.
Right. But no, I mean, but it is. That's it. That's the subtext.
It is. It is.
I've said it so many times, but that I don't want to talk about it too much because when we get to it, you won't be able to shut me up. But the final episode or the final scene of the whole thing, that is sex.
That's just basically giving you a 25-minute soliloquy at the end of this whole run.
It is total sex. It is eroticism dialed up to 1,000. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. It's desire and romantic love expressed through knives and bites and cuts, and it's just phenomenal. It's phenomenal. It's one of the hottest things I've ever seen on television. It really is. But we'll get to it when we get to it. Before that, we were speaking earlier about how gruesome this episode is. Like just how viscerally horrible it is. We get to see a lot of corpses in this episode, and a lot of horrible stuff has been done to them. When we see the first corpse rise surface out of the water, and the poor guy who discovers them, it's flailing about, and he happens to grab one of their faces, which is half rotted, half preserved, and part of it comes off, and there's the limpy, horrible grue, and it's just vile. And it's something that defines this series. I think they maybe got a looser leash with this series because the first one was so popular. they knew that they had an established audience and that they were, the people with the money were not going to be as prohibitive maybe this time. So the Gru is really gruesome.
Hmm.
I mean, we were saying earlier, Jack, that last scene in this episode in Kaiseki, it does something very, very visceral to me. I hate it. I hate it.
Yeah.
It's the worst.
It's hellish. It's absolutely hellish. The scene where the guy wakes up and he's
Oh,
glued and stitched to basically a whole load of dead bodies.
oh my God!
He can't pull his legs apart because they're glued together, and he's as he tries to separate them, he's pulling skin off one side, and and then he sort of looks around and he realizes what he's surrounded by, and it's almost unwatchably horrific.
It's one of the nastiest scenes in the whole thing. I'm sure there are others later. I feel fairly certain there are some scenes later on which are absolutely horrific. But thus far, I think this is the one for me.
Yeah, because like the bit you were just talking about, like gruesome dead bodies falling apart, that really doesn't affect me at all. The reason that the final sequence is so horrifying is, of course, because it's about transcendent suffering. It's about terror and pain and
abjection, confusion, not knowing where you are. Because the guy is also he's not entirely compos mentis. Of course, he's been injected with a certain degree of heroin, I believe.
Well, as you later find out, this is one of the problems we're going to have talking about this episode, which is that this, certainly in terms of like the guest storyline, the serial killer of the week or serial killer of the fortnight, I suppose you'd have to say, in this one and the next episode, and of course it carries on. It sort of carries on. Its ramifications carry on past the next episode as well. It does very much feel like a complete thought, and really, you don't really know what's going on. By the end of Kaiseki, you need to see the next episode to really get the picture in its full dimensions. So I kind of almost don't want to talk about this bit of Kaiseki, so maybe do it next time. But
which is actually useful for me because I've been very disciplined and I haven't moved beyond this episode, so that would be useful actually.
Fair enough. I tell you what.
I try to do that, but I could not help moving on to the next one after Kaiseki.
The only thing that prevented me was I was so damn busy. And this is why we're a bit delayed on doing this recording. So thank you for your indulgence. I was so damn busy with work, and it wasn't just going in to do the work. It was a particularly tricky, not a tricky book, great book, but tricky one to prep and be sure of before I started that. I basically everything stopped. I wasn't reading. I wasn't watching anything. I was just because I had to ask Jack if he would mind giving me his writing, his fiction from the beginning, because I'd been reading Jack's stuff and I got so caught in the mire of this project for work that's if I go back to Jack's work, although I know what he's written, it's not. I've lost the detail. I'm picking up the thread too late. For the way my brain works, quite frankly, let's be honest, it's my own limitations. So it's like,
previously on Jack's silly novel,
I'm going to have to start it again, which I have to say is no chore. It's wonderful, but but I'm sort of like this, and I'm almost to the thing of I think I might watch this first episode again just to pick up the threads before.
I would advise that for the next one, actually, because
I'm going to be it's just it caused a black hole in my entire life, and it was partly because it's your classic thing. There's an Easter market as there is a Christmas market, and it had to be basically rushed out, so we all ended up doing more work on it in a compressed period of time. The work I would have probably taken 2 to 3 weeks to do, I had a week to do.
I would definitely advise rewatching Kaiseki because they are not really two separate episodes. They're one big episode.
But as I recall it, I think this is the point also where it's already started to happen during season one anyway, but the idea of the discrete episode is just really gone now, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah, it
very
really is.
much so,
You'll see echoes of it coming back every now and then. But as soon as we start to hit the sort of Mason Verger stuff, that's it.
I think I'm probably right in saying that Kokia was the point where that started to really happen in earnest, didn't it? You know, the serial killer of the week thing was just getting fuzzier.
Yeah. By the way, can't wait for Mason Verger to turn up because I fucking love him in the show.
and I'm
It's
still
so much fun.
Amazed that he's played by two different actors, because I never saw that join.
I did not know until you mentioned it earlier. I had not the first.
And I was very impressed with the actor who I think plays him first, because I only knew that actor from the series Boardwalk Empire.
Boardwalk Empire, yeah.
Yeah,
Jimmy
and
Darmody.
he was very good in that, but nothing in his performance as Jimmy Darmody quite prepare me for the fact that he was going to be Mason Verger, and such a good Mason Verger as well. Everything. It's
what a joy of a character to play.
There is a character actor who has all the attributes of a leading man, because he's a very good looking guy and everything, but he's gone down the route of striving to be a character actor rather than a leading man, and it's worked out in his favor, because he's done a few things since Jimmy Darmody and Mason Verger where he's trying to plough a slightly more unorthodox furrow than someone of his, let's say, standard of beauty would normally be allowed to do, because they would push him into all the leading man roles, the boring leading man roles, basically, and he's resisted that quite well.
Yeah, obviously, whatever beauty he has as Mason Verger doesn't last for very long.
Well, no.
Actually, that we talk about gruesome scenes. Just wait. Just wait for that one, because is gruesome. That is gruesome.
Yeah.
Well, guys,
steering us back. Sorry, I just wanted to ask one thing. Steering us back a little bit to Kaiseki, because I did carry on afterwards to the next one, which I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
I'm actually a bit muddled in my head about what happens in what episode. Does the stuff where Beverly starts going to see Will, and he comes up with the idea of the color palette,
that's
in Kaiseki?
Yeah,
I remember that.
Right.
Yeah, I remember that.
That's in Kaiseki.
That's a really interesting plot line, isn't it? She's a sort of semi-Clarice, isn't she?
She is a semi-Clarice,
yeah. She's going to the hospital to consult the quote unquote the serial killer to get his insights into an ongoing case. Again, it's Clarice haunting the narrative again.
Of course, in this show, she's also echoing the other version of Clarice, which is Miriam Lass. She is playing out the same path, and will ultimately have the same, well, not the same, but the end that Jack Crawford was led to believe that Miriam Lass had. So yeah. And
I did also a bit of a shudder, actually, because I always watch these with Vic, and it is her inaugural viewing, and she frightened herself at the moment when the guy who wakes up, as you say, he's all glued and stitched, where he's being approached on the train, and the first thing Vicky said was, "Wow, hasn't that guy got an amazing complexion?" And I sort of looked, and then she spent the rest of the episode going, "Oh God, I wish I hadn't said that."
Yeah.
I said, "Well, they obviously cast him well, because that was the point."
Yeah, that's the entire point. Yeah,
they actually they have the unmitigated gall to call the character Roland Umber.
Oh,
I did not know that.
That's so. That's been a common thread throughout this. I mean, we've talked about everything from Bedelia du Maurier, and they keep doing this. It's fantastic though, because you can, in a world that is such a construction, you can get away with that. There's kind of wonderful puns and that's marvelous.
I do love actually the way Hugh Dancy is playing Will now as well, because this version of Will is very different from the Will we see in season one. This version of Will is much more ambiguous. He's playing it as though something has gone wrong in his head as a result of what he's experienced, and you don't really know who he is. In that scene with Beverly, he plays it like an actual serial killer, like a psychopath archetype in a police procedural.
Absolutely.
Something clearly has gone very wrong in his head, though, and he's aware of that, isn't it? I mean, part of what Will is doing, particularly in Kaiseki, is, this is Will in recovery from a complete mental and physical breakdown. Actually, in Kaiseki, he's on his way back from a total breakdown, and again, it's collapse, shattering, and reassembly. Again, we're encountering this again and again. He's trying to reassemble himself from the pieces that he's sort of been left with, and he has, I mean, in a sort of, Hannibal has said to Will, I am your center, I'm your bedrock. Well, no, it's Crawford who says that, but they're competing bedrocks, aren't they?
Yeah.
But Hannibal Hannibal says to Will, I can be your guide. You won't get lost because I'm your guide. I'm your star, whatever it is. And in a kind of a perverse way, he is, because in this absolute moment of crisis, it is the knowledge Will has now that he's come to, that it is Hannibal who is the killer, the copycat, as they've been calling him. I'm not sure if he understands yet that he's the Chesapeake Ripper. I suppose that will become clear as we go on. But it is the knowledge that Hannibal is the one that is allowing. That is actually a sort of criterion of truth. To use the Cartesian term, that is allowing Will to sort of reassemble himself in the right way. Basically, I mean, you get the whole thing about the Alana trying to be useful by doing the hypnotism thing.
Oh, that sequence as well. I mean,
that is what
sees her.
Oh God, that sequence with Alana. You're talking about things that are erotic. That's I mean, from the point of view of a straight man, that's one of the most erotic things I've ever seen on television. The way she turns into this black, angelic, demonic smoke vision of whatever it is. It's so incredibly sexy.
Yeah,
and
I love how the metronome is the same as his like windscreen wiper depiction of when he's in the truck, but it reversed.
Of course, yes,
and that makes sense because he needs something to penetrate back into his, or through what seems to be a psychosis, really. But I almost thought, actually, isn't that what they use and just flip the picture upside down?
But isn't it fascinating the way Will mythologizes her? Because what we're seeing is what Will's seeing, of course. He mythologizes her in the same way he mythologizes Hannibal, right?
The key to that is in the previous episode, because in the previous episode, Saveroux, there's a scene where Will, after he escapes, he goes to Hannibal, and Hannibal is play acting, let's try to work this out. So they're sat opposite each other as they used to, and you get the sequence where Will sort of thinks things through again, and he walks around the room and he sees these frozen tableaux of things that have happened in the past. Cassie Boyle on the antlers, Dr. whatever his name is, with his jaw torn off, etc. Yeah. These victims from the past, from what's happened to him, and they're presented as tableau, and they're just matte black. Yeah. In the same way that the Wendigo figure that he started to see, obviously representing Hannibal, is just this matte black, almost like an obsidian statue. That's what they're like. And when he sees Alana, isn't in that vision when he's hypnotized. She's not static. She's there. And in fact, she turns into smoke or ink and she sort of melts into him. He's enveloped by her. So there's obviously this eroticism about it. But she is nonetheless, she has that same, that matte obsidian look to her. Mm-hmm. So on some level, he's thinking of her as A, a victim, and B, something from the past, a memory. What he sees when he thinks of her is some kind of, it's a memory of something that was. To him, in his fantasy world, that's, she, as a viable prospect for any sort of future, that's gone. Mm-hmm. She's the past. That future has been murdered in the same way as all those people were murdered.
Very beautiful. And also, I mean, I love the internal sequence that follows as well, when he doesn't see what he wants to see. He sees this almost Guillermo del Toro pale man dining table that's full of hideous octopoid Lovecraftian things, and
that's amazing.
Isn't it that
Who sits
imagery.
at the end of the long
Yes, please.
table with the Wendigo.
Yeah. Yes, please. I love that imagery. I
amazing
love it.
stuff.
It's the kind of thing that elevates the show for me, and it hooked me. It hooked me. I love that stuff.
But it's interesting because the hypnotherapy thing seems to not work. In fact, I think Chilton even jokes about it with Hannibal.
Oh yeah, he says he calls it. It's a shame to see a gifted psychiatrist falling for these hoary old chestnuts. I think he calls it. You know,
but it actually does work because that is what, at least this is how I read it. That is what prompts Will to recover the memory of the ear being shoved down his throat through the tube by Hannibal.
Talking about gruesome sequences again, that one is hideous.
Yeah, and the sound design particularly. That sort of echoing down the tube, it's brilliant.
Yeah, you can hear Hugh Dancy also doing like retching, and it's very, very unpleasant. But it is the beginning, isn't it? It's the beginning because again, also visually for the first time, you get some closure as the audience. You get some indication of what actually happened to Will and to Abigail.
Yes, it's starting to pick up those dangling threads from season 1. You also get another one of those moments of dialogue being reassigned because Will has a scene later on where he says, "Memories are all I have now. Imagine my surprise or my delight when I acquire a new one." Well, memories are all I have now. That's from Hannibal in Silence of the Lambs. He says, "Memories are all I have instead of a view." Agent Stark.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
It's wonderful because it's those little things. Will having more of Hannibal's lines. It's showing you his gradual metamorphosis into what Hannibal wants him to be, which is a bit more like him. It's free. It's someone who is free to become their own expression, their own art, without parameter. But wow. And
I will now look forward to the next installment.
Honestly, I mean, season 2 is very, very strong.
The next one is when the muralist subplot comes fully into view, isn't it? We get the guy making the mural from bodies.
That's right.
And I think when we talk about that, it will enable us to kind of to join up with some of the things in Kaiseki as well.
Yeah,
I think Kaiseki is just giving you the prologue to that, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, and it also echoes with stuff from Saveroux as well. I mean, we talked about the recurring theme of seeing and being seen. Well, yeah, that will have application in the next episode.
Yes,
definitely.
Yes, the eye and
exactly that. Looking up and down. But yeah, wow, it's guys, it's been great. It's so lovely to be talking about this show, always and forever.
Good stuff.
Thank
you.
It has been wonderful. Before we go, anything that you guys want to pimp out?
Well, as I mentioned Megan O'Keefe earlier, I mean, because it's basically the only thing I've been that's been going on in my life lately. But it was so concentrate. But if anyone wishes to find out more about the 3D printed people and the horror of being cracked, the saga includes The Bound Worlds, The Blighted Stars, and The Fractured Dark, all by Megan E. O'Keefe.
And I love the titles.
They're great titles. She's got a real grasp of this kind of thing. And obviously, I produce the audiobooks. So if you want to get the audiobooks, you can always get to this. But if you wanted to get the prose, it is again, it's always quite nice, particularly in my line where you just basically get what's coming out, and a lot of the time it's stuff that makes you want to claw your eyes out, frankly, and you push your way through. But this saga, rather like the non-fiction I did, which I know you picked up a copy, Jack, of the Gods Ghostwriters, Candida Moss. It's occasionally really wonderful to get stuff that you feel as though you can plug. Then you think, oh, my job's worthwhile because you've got some really good text to work with. So if anyone was still paying attention when I was droning on about printed people and all that, it's Megan E. O'Keefe's books, and they include The Blighted Stars, The Fractured Dark, and The Bound Worlds. They're very good.
Fantastic. If you want to throw me over some links, Elliot, I'll throw them down below, and people can go and have a look.
Marvelous.
Excellent. Jack?
So yeah, I was going to mention God's Ghostwriters because I did on your recommendation. I did pre-order that
Oh,
on
thank you very much.
Audible, and I've been listening to your very own dulcet tones reading
Oh
the
God.
audiobook. And
Oh yeah.
very,
It's a good. It's
very,
an interesting book though. It's got some good stuff going on.
it's a tremendously interesting book. I'm well into it, and it's it's very, very interesting indeed. I appreciate the author's point of view, and it's really given me a huge food for thought. And it's a little, I mean, I've done it before, but it is a little strange to listen to an audiobook read by somebody that that I've regularly spoken to. But no, you're very good at it, and enjoying that immensely.
Oh, bless you.
Right, so for my own stuff, my blog at Eruditorium Press, I'm on Blue Sky. Just look for Times Carcass, Jack Graham, you'll find me. I have a Patreon where you can get advanced access to things that I do, like this, for instance. You'll get this a few days before it goes up at George's YouTube. Anything I write, anything I podcast usually goes up there in advance. But the main thing is I don't speak German. The podcast I do with Daniel Harper about the far right, and that is back now. And we do have some... We haven't quite picked up the production schedule in the way that we hoped, but we have got new stuff out from recently. So pop over to our Libsyn or look on your podcast catcher or whatever and find us there. We also did a guest appearance on the podcast Red Rose Film Club, talking about the Spike Lee movie Black Klansman. So if you want to hear us doing a guest appearance on somebody else's show, there's that you can listen to.
Fantastic. If you could throw over a link to that, Jack, I'll put that down below as well, along with everything else.
I can do that.
Yep, no problem. As for myself, same as usual, guys. You can find me here at Exaggerated Elegy, going up tomorrow at the point of recording, which is going to be Sunday. No, it's not going to be Sunday, is it? It's going to be Saturday, the 6th of April. There will be the last episode thus far of my ongoing chats with Gerard Galvin Barry, Wolfgang One, on the Alien series. We did Alien Covenant. It was an afterthought, but we did do Alien Covenant. It was interesting to talk about because it's such a astronomically boring film. It really is. I forget about that film.
I can't remember
Prometheus
it.
is.
I know
Prometheus
I've seen
is
it.
not boring. I have loads of
Prometheus is not
problems
boring.
with Prometheus, but
I can't
it's not
remember
boring.
Covenant.
This is the problem. This is the problem. I have seen it many times, and every time I watch it, like a few months go by, and I forget it. I completely forget.
I saw it at the cinema, and I remember that Catherine Waterston is gorgeous, and I remember that it visually copies the original movie in ways that were irritating and completely pointless. And I remember that there's some sort of plot point about the Michael Fassbender character misattributing a line of poetry. Yeah, he's still in it. Yeah, and there's a plot point around him misattributing a line of poetry to Byron when it was actually Shelley.
That's right.
That's basically the only thing I remember about it.
That's it. It's
the only thing I remember.
And it's awful. It's so contrived. I mean, you know what? We talk about it in the podcast. It's so fucking contrived. It doesn't work. It's so annoying. But yes, we'll be. If you want to hear Gerard and I rant about that film, that'll be up tomorrow morning at about 9:30. I'm never going to stop banging on about this. Go over to Arrow Films, look for the Quartet of Torment, the new Hellraiser UHD and Blu-ray set. The friend of the podcast and regular on this channel, Kit Power, and myself, we are on the featurette Hell is What They Wanted on the Hellbound disc. Links to all of my published work, my short story collections, and the anthologies and collections I feature in are available over at strangeplaygrounds.com. And if you go to the Evil Empire of Amazon and type in George Daniel Lee, you'll find my Amazon author page as well. I'm also on Blue Sky. There is an account over on Twitter, but it's not really active anymore because I just can't be bothered with it. And I think that's it for me too, guys. Thank you once again, and I can't wait to get on to the next episode. Really can't.
Let's try to get there quick, because I'm really looking forward to talking about the whole sort of muralist subplot, because that is so fucking freighted. It's unbelievable.
Oh, there's so much. You know what? If we will start, won't we? And then there'll be like an appendix episode. So next time, guys. Until then, bye bye.
Bye.